Welcome to American Cannabis, sponsored by Cannabis Tech Media. I'm your host, Ellis Smith with American Cannabis Company, and today's featured topic is Geoponics with Dr. Av Singh, Ph.D. Av, welcome today. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ellis. Thanks for having me.
You bet. I'm excited to have you on today. This is a topic that is very dear to my heart. I just have been exposed to organic gardening and farming for many, many years, and excited to share this topic today with our audience. So, Av, if you will, I've got about an 8-page resume and CV here for you, and there's no way I have the time to go through this whole thing. So if you want to touch on a few highlights of your career, give our audience kind of a background of who you are.
Great, thanks. So I guess coming into the cannabis world, I don't come from the subculture. My entrance into the work with cannabis comes from my work in and with organic farmers. So I did my doctorate work at the University of Manitoba around pasture-based livestock production, and that kind of gave me the foundational stuff of learning a lot about the soil and the importance of soil in actually producing good feed for livestock. From that, I went on to do some work with organic farmers in Nova Scotia, and doing a lot of extension work. My philosophy in extension was essentially my job as an extension agent was to kind of bring out the inner knowledge, the traditional knowledge within that farmer, and try to use that knowledge of the farmer had, and bring that in and marry it with some of the science that I was bringing onto the farm. And many times, doing that work with organic farmers, especially when you're out in field and you're identifying diseases, whether it's intestinal parasites in sheep or powdery mildew on zucchini, many of these farmers would kind of bring you in, and just as about you're ready to leave the farm, they might say, I'm growing a bunch of tomatoes in my basement. Can you come and take a look at them? And that was that was the code word to figure out that there was cannabis growing on, and learning a lot about cannabis that way. And so that was kind of my introduction into the world of cannabis. And then I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, working here in Nova Scotia, American Cannabis Company had a client that was one of Canada's first certified organic medicinal marijuana producers, and we had this super soil, and but there was something lacking. I was brought on to sort of make sure that this could go full throttle right from clone to flower, or clone to harvest, and that's my segue into coming into the American Cannabis Company. So the foundations are really around soil, around organic farming, and now bringing a lot of that into the cannabis sector.
Awesome, thanks, Av. Well, let's go ahead and dive into this. Our topic today is geoponics, and this is a new term that we're really trying to coin in the marketplace to kind of separate ourselves from how most cannabis production is being done when you hear the hydroponics or the deep water culture systems and these type of terminology. So let's dive in. Explain to me what geoponics is.
Yeah, so I think you described it really well in the ideas that we were looking to bring soil back into growing. And even when I was thinking about what would be some good titles for this presentation, a lot of times we were kind of bouncing around those ideas of how do we get soil back into growing. And it's surprising to think, this is a foundational aspect of agriculture, and yet it has somehow lost favor. Two things like aeroponics, hydroponics, or something that may be more cutting edge than something that's been done for thousands and thousands of years. So the idea of geoponics is really just a sexy way of saying, let's start growing back into soil. what American Cannabis Company has done with this idea of geoponics is the idea that we can actually start doing a lot of this in a living soil system. So we're emphasizing organic philosophies, emphasizing that the soil is not just soil, but in fact it's a living soil. And so geoponics, whether it's growing in a container system, which is often the case in these warehouse facilities, but it's also talking about the importance of a living soil in outdoor growing, whether it's cannabis or hemp.
Okay. Now, explain to me, let's go into detail now. Let's dive in a little bit deeper, and let's talk about the root systems and why it's important to grow in soil, and looking at all the beneficial bacteria and fungus that we really are utilizing to take advantage of and feed the plant. So let's get a little more granular and talk about the root structure and how these symbiotic relationships are played with these different microbes that are in the soil that we're using.
Sure. I think, once again, it's kind of our philosophy that when we talk about soil, we're talking about a living soil. And the idea of geoponics, and now I'm not going to try to beat up on hydroponics or aeroponics. We don't want to be overly dogmatic about the way people produce. But geoponics, or, growing in a living soil, is arguably a very simple system. But its simplicity comes from the idea that there's a bit of humility with that. It's the idea that simplicity comes from the fact that we know that the system is so complex that we're not actually going to know exactly what's going on. And we're okay with that. It's kind of, that's why the title of this talk is Why Mother Nature Knows Best. It's almost giving, that humble attitude in terms of saying, we're not going to know everything, but Mother Nature knows. So the plant and the soil kind of know what's going on. Our job is just as the stewards of that relationship. And so when you look at a hydroponic or an aeroponic system, arguably we're almost putting ourselves in the situation that we're Mother Nature. We think we know what the plant needs. We think we know what it wants, and we try to deliver it. And it's worked out quite well in terms of making sure that you get really good high yields. But arguably, the system is so complex, and so trying to be able to think that we actually have enough control, that we can control those variables that in many cases we still don't know exactly what's going on, is a lot of hubris, in my opinion. And so what we think is, if you bring a lot of humility into your practice, knowing that your job is to make sure that you are trying to meet what you think the soil and the life in that soil needs, and that the relationship that has co-evolved, that the plant and the soil have co-evolved for thousands of years, they've worked out as some type of relationship, that would be, that's kind of the approach that we want to take. So that being said, one of the most important things to remember is that in a geoponic system, in a living soil system, is the fact that there's life, and we want to emphasize that our job as these stewards is not to assume that we know exactly what the life in that soil want. The common mantra that used to be used in organic farming was that, we're going to feed the soil will feed the plant. Whereas, oftentimes in a more chemical farming, it's like, we're going to feed the plant. What we're looking at it in a living soil system is we're actually saying that our mantra is, we're going to feed the soil life and let the soil life and the plant decide how they're going to feed each other. So it's it may sound like semantics, but it's a very different philosophy that we take on. And once again, it's that whole acknowledgement of this relationship that the plant and the life in the soil have evolved together for thousands of years, and they've kind of decided, this is what I need, and I'm going to give you this, and this is what you need, and so I'll give you that. And so I think you had mentioned something about how important those roots are. And this is one of the most important things that when we're talking about growing cannabis, especially growing cannabis in containers, is that I like to think that it is all about the roots. We have to remember that plants, especially the cannabis plant almost behaves like a warm season plant. It grows quite rapidly. It has very high photosynthetic ability. So it is taking a lot of the sugars that it makes, and that's the whole philosophy behind, or the whole foundational principle behind agriculture, is the fact that plants have this ability to harness energy from the sun and turn that into sugar. Well, cannabis at times will spend about 50% of the sugars that it produces and throw that into the roots. So it's all of this, essentially energy being transformed into a caloric value, often sugar, and putting that in the roots. And essentially, why is it doing that? It's doing that quite simply to say, we want something from that life in the soil, and so we're going to feed it, and then it's going to in turn feed us what we need. And so that's the amazing thing about having really good root system. When we're talking in a geoponics sense, and we're using these containers, it's really important that we make sure that we are generating the greatest amount of root mass, because your roots are not only going to be your sources of how the plants are going to be able to take up a lot of nutrients, but they are also a food source for the life in that soil. And so when we talk about making sure that there's going to be a good terpene profile or a good cannabinoid profile, we want to make sure that there's enough roots that are then being able to produce essentially the precursors to the foods that will end up becoming terpenes and cannabinoids. And that's why oftentimes when you're thinking about growing in a container system, watering becomes so important. In the systems that we often promote through the American Cannabis Company, we're often promoting the use of sub-irrigated planters, or sort of a bottom watering type pot. A common brand would be the Auto Pot, and essentially in that system, the plant, once relatively mature, the plant will dictate how much water it's going to be taking up. But in order to be able to do that, it's so important that the early parts of the plant life cycle, we've done a lot of work to make sure that there's really good root growth. And so, for example, when you're watering, that's where you want to make sure initially you want to be top watering, making sure that you're getting out to the edges so that you can be able to get roots to grow not only straight down, but getting out and using as much of the surface area of that soil.
I'm going to kind of recap here. So as Av kind of mentioned here, we don't want to say that this system is better than these other methodologies of growing. That's not what we want to point out. We want to just point out the differences in these. And so it's really, when you look at the root systems and how we're feeding these with the traditional nutrient regimen, we're really, I don't want to use the word force feeding, but we're really trying to dictate exactly what the plant's trying to eat. And with our methodology and style and with geoponics, it's really about allowing the plant to really show its genetic potential. and by creating the environment for it, by allowing this soil to feed it what it needs and allow the plant to eat when it wants, you see very different characteristics with plants when you see them growing in a traditional growing method with chemical fertilizers versus using a living soil. You see colors that you don't see that really present themselves in a living soil. You see terpene profiles that really are a lot higher and heightened when they come out with the when you look at the levels when they're growing in living soils. And so, just from our experience, these are just the things that we have been able to take away when comparing it to other methodologies. And we're not saying it's better; it's just the things that we have noticed through these systems. And so, as I've kind of touched on with the gravity-fed capillary feeding systems, this has been our approach to really hacking what's been traditionally done with cannabis growing. We really are thinking outside the box. I don't want to use the term hydroorganics, but that's sort of what we've kind of have done. We kind of have a system that has access to water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but we gave it a medium that is very non-traditional of how these plants are traditionally grown. And so we have really stepped outside the box in the way we look at growing this on a commercial scale. And this is kind of our approach to lean manufacturing and growing of cannabis. And so it's a unique aspect. It's very outside the box of how traditional things have been done, but we're finding great success with it. And at the end of the day, it's meeting our expectations on production per square foot, as well as meeting our terpene profiles, cannabinoid profiles, and ideally a lean workflow behind it all. So,
yeah. So
let's go on to.
I'm sorry, I was just going to draw upon one of your comments there. It's really important to recognize that the difference between this system and perhaps other systems is that this is almost plant-led. So even in terms of its watering, it's being driven. Of course, your environmental factors will affect what type of transpiration rates you'll have, but essentially the plant will be dictating how much it wants to consume in terms of water, how much it's going to consume in terms of feed, and what type of feed it wants to be taking or needs to be taking. So I like to look at it as it's plant-led growing. So it's kind of unique, whereas in other systems, even in other soil systems, we might be trying to dictate how and when the plant should be drinking and eating, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you're starting to see, as our industry has really come from our basements and becoming more industrialized and commercialized, this style of growing using this technique has been known in the cannabis world. Nothing has really been done as far as a product that's been shelf ready for the consumer to come and purchase and take home and use. There's been a lot of recipes that float around that you can make at home. I'm sure everybody has some kind of kiddie pool experience where they've mixed dirt in a kiddie pool in their basement or laid out a tarp and mixed it up. I know I spent years and years and years doing it the first way with the Sohum Living Soils that we are now packaging and selling. And we're starting to see other brands come out in the marketplace as well, like Kiss Organics, Kind Soil. And so you're starting to see this trend of this type of methodology now starting to make a splash. So the just add water type methodology, taking out the thinking, removing all of the human error aspect to growing cannabis. It can be very, very challenging when you watch someone who has no idea about growing cannabis go into a grow store and have to buy a pH meter, and then have to buy pH up and pH down, and then they've got to buy a 3 or 5 part nutrient line with all these other additives that come along with it. And it now looks like chemistry because you've got every color of the rainbow nutrients that you're trying to use, and it's hard to make rhyme or reason behind this. And so you're starting to see these type of products that are really simplified, almost like Chia Pet, just add water. And so it's exciting to really see the shift and change moving towards this, and it's really opening up the landscape of where this industry is going as far as organic cultivation of cannabis is going.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to recognize and give homage to the subculture. These super soils were, I think, in Canada probably in the mid 80s, growers within the subculture were coming out with these super soils, these just add water soils. For the most part, they always needed something, maybe a compost tea or a fermented tea or something given to them sort of in the flowering phase. It's nice to see something like, our product, the Sohum Living Soils, something that will go from seed or clone right to harvest. But a lot of this has been built on the subculture, those growers who've been growing for 40, 50 years, using a lot of these organic amendments, mixing up, seeing what works and what doesn't work. And so, it's really nice to start seeing folks like Sohum and Kiss coming out with these water-only soils. They, you use Ellis, you use the phrase, taking out that thinking, and it does. It's in many ways, it's saying, there's no way that us as humans are going to be able to understand the complexity between the plant-soil and soil-life interface. And it's sort of saying, I acknowledge that. Here's the best we can do in terms of we're going to give you a lot of life in your soil. We're going to amend it with a lot of great nutrients. And then you go ahead and do your magic. And I think that's really important to recognize that. One of the things I really want to emphasize, one of the times when we're trying to market our soil, the Sohum Living Soil, we often market it as this is going to save you labor. And it does. You no longer have to, worry about mixing bottles and figuring out that this is the time to feed and you have to feed this or feed that. But what I really want to emphasize is that what I'd love to see more growers do is spend more time on pruning, on cropping, on training and trellising their cannabis. And, we often are looking at genetics and nutrients to be our ways of increasing yield, but management is a huge opportunity to really change your yields.
I love that point, Av. That's a great point to add there. And this kind of goes into a question that we just had kind of come in here. And so here's the question. It says, what are thoughts from top watering versus using a capillary mat and watering from the bottom up? And so I'll make my two-minute spiel real quick, Av, and then I'll let you add on from your professional standpoint. So through my experience, Sohum, for the 10 years I used it before I put it in a capillary system, was always top fed from the top down. And so that's how I traditionally have always used it. Once I scaled and went to a commercial setting, I just needed a lean process and found this system that worked great with what I was doing, or else I would have been doing more than likely a drip system from the top down. But I really saw increased water uptake from the capillary system that I was using, and that really drove me to keep that pathway as I just saw growth results that I had never seen before, where I really broke not only the 2-pound of light mark on a 1,000-watt light, but I got close to that 3-pound mark, and that really opened my eyes of the ability of accessing more water to the plant. I can get bigger yields. As I've said, it's not necessarily about all the food going to the plant. It's also the water and the pruning and the training and those techniques. So, Av, I'll let you give your thoughts on this question as well.
Well, I totally agree with you. I think the other point I'd like to bring up is the idea that, when you're top watering, water will have the path of least resistance. And you have to be a really good waterer. You have to take a lot of time to do top watering. You want to make sure that you're not just, dumping water right into the middle or dumping it to a particular side, which has already created a nice little pathway. So the water is coming, easily bypassing a lot of the roots. I really want to emphasize the importance of top watering early on and getting great root development, making sure that as much of the space in the container or as much of in an outdoor grow that if you're growing in a large stack or even in the ground, that you've established a great early on root mass. But it's really important to recognize that the idea that not every plant behaves the same, not every strain behaves the same, and so I'm sure many growers have gone around lifting their pots and checking the weight, and one pot seems heavy and the one right next to it seems a little bit lighter, and it's watering day and you're going to go and water regardless, plants do behave differently. And so the idea that they can choose when they drink and how much they drink, it does make life a little easier. Definitely a lean process, but I think it also respects the variability that we have within our genetics.
Great answer. I couldn't have said it more better. And from my personal experience, when I had my first dispensary in 2010 and I was managing the cultivation facility, and our goal was to walk around every other day to pick up plants to see how wet or light they were, and that would determine who would water. And depending on who was hungover, who wasn't, would go water. And to see the inconsistencies behind the watering when we were doing this from my staff, because they maybe partied the night before or about something with their girlfriend the next day, and you never could get consistency behind the watering. And it's pretty funny to see that some people can't even water a plant properly, and this is something that you see all over. And so these types of systems just are make it so the plant can really, once again, reach its genetic potential, but two, it's ease of workflow. It's taking out just all of the human error side of it, and it just simplifies the workflow. So,
yeah, it's amazing. Working with a lot of organic farmers, oftentimes, watering transplants, they would often leave that to what you may call unskilled labor, and I'd often comment that, many times farmers are forgetting how much knowledge they actually have. And the fact that they know exactly how to water is something that, I definitely don't have that knowledge myself. They know exactly how to do it. And so it's really important that you just don't give that job, that watering job, until somebody's well-trained to really understand how to take the time to make sure that you're watering. And a lot of it is trying to really understand that plant. Here's why it's so important to have a dense root system. It's less important in hydroponics and aeroponics, but in a living soil system, every root you can grow increases your surface area. Every root you can, every little bit of root you can grow is a food source for better terpene synthesis, better cannabinoid synthesis. So you want to make sure you can maximize on the amount of roots being produced.
Agreed. Let's touch on Brix Levels. Explain to the audience what Brix Levels are and how, when you look at Brix compared to traditional grown vegetables or cannabis compared to living soils, and really what this means.
So when you look at a lot of the super soils that are out on the market, they might use the terminology nutrient dense. And once again, it's going with that philosophy. We don't know exactly what you want, but we're going to throw it all in there. So it's essentially, a lot of these super soils are creating like a grocery store of all these potential foods. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet of amendments in there. You're going to have your feather meal, your bone meal, blood meal, alfalfa meal, crab meal, kelp meal, so on and so forth. It's all in there. And the reason it's being done that way is that we really don't know exactly what the plant needs. But what we have found is that if we make sure that the life in the soil has what it needs, the plants are able to have a nutrient-dense plant, and you get increased nutrient density. So essentially, Brix, it's a measure of the total dissolved solids in the leaf sap. And so for the most part, we see that as the total dissolved solids would be like the nutrient content or the sugars that are in the sap. But they also include things like vitamins and antioxidants and some of the stuff that we really want in a good, healthy product. What we found is that the higher the Brix level, so the higher the nutrient density in a plant, the healthier the plant, you get better storage. Like if it's a vegetable crop, you're going to get a longer storage life with it. But what we've really found interesting is the fact that the higher the Brix level, the less likely it is going to be affected by either pest attack, so pests like thrips, spider mites, whiteflies, aphids, but at the same time also less susceptible to diseases like powdery mildew or botrytis. So what our goal is to make sure that if we can get a nutrient-dense, well-balanced plant with a high Brix level, we can actually have a much healthier plant that is going to be less susceptible to both pests and diseases. What we do to actually measure that is there's an instrument called a Refractometer, a very simple device. You can probably pick one up at a local grow shop. It's usually maybe about $50, $60. And essentially what you're looking at is that you will take a couple of maybe fan leaf leaves and then using a garlic press or perhaps even a set of pliers, and you kind of squeeze out a little bit of the juice coming out of those leaves. Taking a look at those, the refractometer, if you shine it up to the sun or any type of light, you'll actually see it give you the level of the total dissolved solids. And what we found is that anything above 12, 13%, the amount of sugars that are actually in that sap are in fact, they're not healthy for sap-sucking insects. So you're going to have essentially they are indigestible to these insects, and so they don't fall prey to it. In terms of diseases, what they found is that the pH on the leaf surface is one that does not make it it's not a compatible host for something like a powdery mildew spore. It may land on the leaf, but it's not going to take hold because of the nutrient density of that leaf. So that's one way of looking at the importance of having a soil that has a lot more in there than perhaps you think you need in a soil.
You just schooled me once again, Av. That's why I love sitting down with you and speaking with you, because you seem to touch on details that I tend to overlook and don't understand. So this is great. I really appreciate that. And so this is, I want to add on to that, to where, as we look at all these different amendments that we're using and really trying to, come up with a final end product, and Av can speak to this, where we have been trying to source high quality amendments that are going into these super soils, specifically SOHUM. And so we have had some issues with sourcing where we were getting OMRI certified worm castings that we were finding had DDT in it, and then we were finding our coconut core source was showing coliform issues and on a bacteria side. And so for us, we had to go back to the drawing board, look at where we're sourcing our inputs from. And Av really brings a high standard of what our expectations are to go into all of our inputs. And so we really have sourced and analyzed and looked at what's available in the marketplace, what makes sense to us as far as the quality and standard we want, and then ensuring we can have that source continued for the long term of this business. And so you got to be careful out there when you're looking at amendments and what's being sold, as we have learned, let's say, the hard way, and have had to really understand moving forward where we're getting good quality amendments, building those long-term relationships, and almost treating it like a farm-to-table type restaurant where you know exactly where all your food is coming from. Same thing with our inputs. Those relationships are there. And so you guys want to add that point there.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that is we're sort of in the infancy of this sector going incredibly public, and so once again, as I think some of the traditional knowledge out of the subculture becomes more mainstream, we're going to start seeing a lot of other amendments, and so I don't want to be overly dogmatic about saying that you can't grow a good cannabis if you don't have kelp meal in there. Although I'm a big fan of kelp meal, but at the same time there's going to be new amendments, and there's going to be other products that people are going to say, I really need this in my soil. And so I think this is going to always be an evolution. We've seen this with the original super soils that almost had it to take a plant through its full cycle, but just didn't have enough. One of the things that we've done with Sohum is that we've added a probiotic to our mix, and that has definitely added a lot better nutrient cycling within our soil mix, and also I think has given an opportunity to have a far more robust terpene profile, a far more robust cannabinoid profile, because you're getting a lot more root production, you're getting a lot more of these sort of precursors to the terpenes and to the cannabinoids coming out of the life that's in that soil. And probiotics, I don't know if I'm going on a tangent here, but probiotics are definitely something that have really done well in cannabis, and I think it's going to be a growing market. I'd love to see more of this actually happen within vegetable production. I'd love to see a lot more of the organic farmers that I work with start adopting a lot of these products, because I think they can really turn things around and get a lot more fuel out of the soil that you may have.
I agree. It was, I've put a lot of time in working with that soil, and to discover that we could add an inoculant like this to really help us get through that full duration was just exciting for me, and to really understand, the true complexity of what's going on in the soil life. And once again, it was groundbreaking for us. It really allowed us to achieve our end goal with lean manufacturing of cannabis, and I think it's a trick that a lot of growers have realized, and more coming over and utilizing it. And so to kind of add on that, you can inoculate your hydroponic systems with these things, correct? And so there's still the ability to improve some of those things in those systems, right?
Yeah, that's whether it's hydroponics, aeroponics, you got roots there, and there's a lot of hydroponic growers who are already using probiotics, but I would encourage those that aren't to give it a try. Our product, Dr. Mary Jane, is quite interesting. It's got three main species in it. Two are Bacillus subtilis species, and one's a Pseudomonas species. So you're getting with the Bacillus subtilis, which some of our listeners might already be familiar with. It's the biofungicide that's often used as a foliar to address things like powdery mildew, to botrytis. It's in a few different formulations as a foliar, but Bacillus subtilis is one of these bacteria that actually help cycle nitrogen. They can, in fact, make nitrogen. They can fix nitrogen. They're also, a bacteria that it's almost like they are trying evolutionary, saying, the best way for us to thrive is to make new roots. So they have the ability to actually make, they almost produce a growth hormone that produces more roots. It just makes a lot of evolutionary sense that they can do that for them. The Pseudomonas is one of the challenges we've often had in super soils, is that phosphorus is one of these elements that can really quickly bind on to a lot of other nutrients or other items in the soil, and then making it less available for the plant to take up. So what the Pseudomonas does in our soil is cycle phosphorus. And so just, as you're just about to go into flowering, when the plant needs a lot more energy, there's phosphorus available. Phosphorus is one of those, main elements that really drives energy. When you're later in the flowering phase and you want a little bit more phosphorus, that's when that Pseudomonas is kicked in and making some of that phosphorus more available. So it's pretty interesting what these probiotics can do. You look at there's a product called EM, Effective Microorganisms. It's a more of a fermented, so you're getting a lot of anaerobic products in that. It's based out of some work that was done probably 60, 70 years ago in Japan. But you're getting a lot of lactobacillus species or lactic acid bacteria in that EM product. Works really well in hydroponics, aeroponics. You can spray that on. Lactobacillus species are great. They are, high fat. You're going to get a lot of phosphatase coming out of those bacteria, and that becomes kind of a precursor to producing terpenes, producing some of the cannabinoids. A great way of doing that. I was thinking of other probiotics. Mycorrhizae. You've probably we often get that question. Do you have mycorrhizae in your soil? We purposely don't add mycorrhizae in our soil, in the Sohum soil, in large part because we've got a fully amended soil. So we've got a lot of phosphorus that's quite available. We have a lot of other nutrients that are readily available. And to put something like a mycorrhizal inoculant in, the plant most likely isn't going to form a relationship with it when you have all these readily available nutrients. What happens is mycorrhizal fungi forms a symbiotic relationship with the roots, but it's one in which the plant dictates whether it wants to form the relationship or not. So if I've got a lot of readily available nutrients, as a plant, I'm not going to give you some free sugar, which is usually the exchange that the fungi and the plant have, is that the plant gives the fungi some sugar, and in exchange, the fungi gives phosphorus or nitrogen or water, whatever the trade is planned. And if it's already readily available, as a plant, I'm going to say no. I'm not going to let you infect me, and I would resist. So that's why we don't add it. But I can see that if you went into like a no-till system in which you wanted to reuse some soil, I think then that makes a lot of sense to perhaps inoculate your roots using an inoculant like mycorrhizae. One other thing, there's a specific species that you want to use with cannabis, and it keeps changing its name. It's something like glomulus was the original name. So if you have some old packages of mycorrhizal inoculant, you might see the term glomulus. If not, it might be called Rhizophagus intradices. My Latin's not that great, so. But look for that Rhizophagus or glomulus, and there might be some subspecies that are different, but that's what you really want with cannabis if you're looking for mycorrhizae.
Once again, you always seem to eloquently explain this stuff way better than I ever could. Explain a little more on plant exudates and nutrient cycling, and then a balanced intake of nutrients.
Sure. And this goes back to that dance between the plant and the soil life. And this is that coevolution. Thousands and thousands of years ago, the plants, evolved most likely somewhere in Central Asia along a riverbank. And what the plant was doing is saying, hey, if I produce all these sugars and I feed it to the bacteria, what will you give me? And it can be it's very interesting and this is where a lot of humility comes in, because we really don't know exactly all that the life in the soil can give. So there's bacteria, there's archaea, there's fungi, there's protozoa, nematodes, and so on and so forth. There's such immense life that's in the soil, and the plant can alter their exudates, so essentially altering maybe some of the amino acids or some of the sugars to cater to what the plant really needs. So, for example, if a plant is being, let's use the example where a plant is being topped. So we've got a cannabis plant and we're going to top it. For a plant, topping is or pruning or anything like that, it's going to start seeing that as herbivory. So it's going to interpret the fact that I'm getting cut as maybe an insect is coming, or maybe there's a deer that's coming and eating some of my leaves. So the plant is essentially saying, I need help. And so what it may do is send a signal down through its exudates to feed a particular type of bacteria that is going to then create a terpene that's going to repel the herbivory that's happening. So, essentially maybe producing something that's going to be a repellent to whatever, insect that it's interpreting is biting them or whatever. So it just shows that's the type of relationship these exudates have, that the plant can alter it very slightly to help create something that the plant can then use. This whole world of terpenes is absolutely phenomenal. We're still learning so much about it. I mean, terpenes are probably what a lot of people would refer to as the most common language in the world. Bacteria use terpenes to talk to one another, and probably to other species as well. So terpenes are actually a way of communicating. And so it's so important to see how exudates are actually used as a communication tool.
Wow, you just made my head explode, Av, on that one. That's pretty fascinating stuff. So interesting.
It's one of the things that it's kind of interesting when you start thinking about this whole dog eat dog world in the soil, is that oftentimes the plant is doing these things to actually increase its immune system. So what we have is there's a concept of priming in which even terpenes will be used to stimulate a response within a plant. So the terpenes that are being produced in the plant will be exudated out into the soil, and in turn, the soil bacteria will respond to that and now give an alternate terpene or an alternate cannabinoid, something that's being produced to sort of fire up the plant. It's essentially what they call systemic acquired resistance or a systemic acquired response. It's really essentially saying, let's boost up my immune system because there might be some type of pest or pathogen that might be affecting me. And of course, those terpenes, those cannabinoids, that's what we really want in cannabis. So that's why a little bit of stress is a benefit to what we want to harvest in cannabis.
But once again, we're allowing Mother Nature allow that to happen on its own. Like you said, it's so neat to hear a Ph.D. doctor talk about how we don't know enough about the plant to really dictate what to feed it, and so that really is a great point here to add to that from this comment that these things are happening on such a micro scale. How could we ever really know how to provide what these things need, directly and so specifically, versus allowing a growing medium that is chock full of everything it needs and allowing Mother Nature to take care of it itself.
Yeah, and I think it's it's so important to recognize that yes, we're talking about using probiotics. In Dr. Mary Jane, yes, there's 3 different bacterial species. It's important to recognize that that's just an inoculant. What you really want, and this is where a living soil system has a little bit more of a benefit than just hydroponics and aeroponics, where yes, you may spray on some trichoderma or some rhizophagus or some bacillus subtilis. Here in a living soil system, if you've got a really amazing worm casting, earthworm castings, if that's in your soil, of course you've got thousands and thousands of different species of bacteria, thousands of species of fungi, nematodes in there, protozoa. All of that can have a real bearing on making sure that the plant is the potential of being as healthy as it can be, and getting closer to reaching that genetic potential that we often talk about.
Everyone pay close attention to what he just said, because it's super important to understand how worm castings alone can really do wonders for your soil. And it's an important component as a good base to start with your living soils. And as he said, there's thousands of different bacteria and fungus and protozoa and all these things happening in there. So just even starting with that's a great way to have a baseline with your super soils. How do humates play into this, Av?
Well, actually, you can tie in humates quite well with earthworm castings. Now, you can buy humates separately as an amendment, and humates essentially are organic material, sort of well broken down, larger pieces of organic material that tend to have a lot of negatively charged sites. So they've got this ability to hold on to a lot of nutrients. And humates also, you may have heard the term chelated. Chela comes from a Latin term meaning claw, and so humates are a chelating agent. And essentially that means that humates have that ability to hold on to nutrients and make them available for the plant to then take up. As I mentioned before, nutrients, if you just throw in a whole bunch of phosphorus or nitrogen or potassium into your soil, what happens is that something else grabs it. And oftentimes it's immobilized or it's no longer plant available. And so the plant, even though there's lots of phosphorus, I can do a soil test and it shows that I got a lot of phosphorus in the soil, it's not plant available because it's been tied up by, say, something like aluminum. If you've got a lot of humates in your soil, you have the ability, the humates will grab onto that phosphorus and hold on to it until a plant wants to take it up. And so it allows it to be more readily available in that manner. Earthworm castings are a great source of that. And so a lot of times people will think that, I've got a really good product, I've got all these great amendments, I don't think I need earthworm castings. Well, the benefit of earthworm castings, even throwing a little amount into your nutrient mix, is that it tends to make whatever your nutrients are more available. And so that's why I'm a big advocate for earthworm castings, not only because they are these, amazingly rich in terms of things like calcium and have a nice high pH to them, but also the fact that they will actually make your nutrients, whether they're synthetic or organic, more available.
Okay, great answer. All right, we got about 5 minutes here, so I kind of want to put one question out there for you to really kind of wrap this up and see, just to kind of give a kind of synopsis of this conversation today and where you really see the industry going as far as indoor cultivation versus outdoor cultivation, and eventually, will it become a commodity? And I think we're going to see all these things happen where it's going to get growing outside. We're going to be really going to what your background and specialty is, and so I think we're just I'm fine-tuning my skills indoors with this methodology of growing to get prepared for the future of outdoor growing, and that's kind of my 2 cents on this. So if you would give a quick little synopsis of our talk today on geoponics and where you kind of see the industry going.
Sure. I think here in Canada, we're definitely as we're starting to learn a lot more about the potential of cannabis as a medicine, we're going to start seeing a greater emphasis on things like a terpene profile, on a cannabinoid profile. As we learn more about these other cannabinoids, as we learn more about terpenes, as we learn more about the entourage effect between cannabinoids and terpenes, we are definitely going to be wanting more of them. And the best way to do that is through a living soil system. So I can really see us really pushing towards more and more people growing a living soil system because of the robustness of the final end product. That being said, right now I'm not sure what the price for flower is in the U.S., but maybe it's $1,500 a pound or more, or maybe less. But as states like California come into the market and more states start getting regulated, or allowing for more cannabis growth, and we start seeing that price come down, I think it's going to be really important for us to recognize that we want to make this as sustainable as we can. And so the idea of using a soil is really important, but also to make sure that we're reusing that soil. And so despite the fact that we sell a soil and would love to keep selling it, we have to recognize some sustainability issues. And we're using products like peat, which are heavily regulated, and you can't harvest more peat than in Canada. It's highly regulated how much peat you're allowed to harvest per season, and it's got to be relatively sustainably done. So we're going to be running out of things like peat moss, and we'll have to be using them more responsibly. And that's where I think it's interesting. We talk about these no-till systems that are happening. I'm not ready to make sure that I'd love to do a little more research to see. In the sort of these auto pots that we use, they're about 6.5 gallons. Can you actually grow in that pot one more time? Can you reuse the soil another time? And that's where I think it's going to be really important to do a little bit of research on that to make sure that can actually happen. But I think that's kind of the evolution. Right now, it's pretty common for many of our growers to use the soil once, but there is, because of the life in the soil and because of the capacity of the plant, it's very easy to be able to generate another full cycle out of that soil. The challenge being is you have to be a really good grower to make sure that you can identify any deficiencies within the plant and the ability to be able to identify any diseases that might happen as a result of not getting rid of certain material. But the idea that you can just plant right back into a soil where there was lots of roots, I actually think you're going to have an increased terpene profile because of it, because you already have a lot of root mass that's there that's going to start breaking down. What's going to break that down is just going to become a good precursor to terpenes, to cannabinoids. And so when I think about the future, we are going to take sustainability even more seriously, and that would mean starting to reuse the soil, making sure that we're getting the biggest bang for our buck, and making sure that it's environmentally sound. Which is great. I mean, having high organic matter soils now, if we use that spent soil and we put that soil outdoors, we can be very confident that we're not going to have a phosphate leaching. We're not going to have nitrogen leaching, because it's a high organic matter soil that's going to be able to hold on to those nutrients until the next plant can then use them.
I agree with you. I used to use Sohum over and over many moons ago when I was making it in kiddie pools, and I really enjoyed rebuilding the soil back up and reusing it and just finding a healthier immune system on the plant. And so I can't wait to be able to get to that point in the industry to where we are reusing and recycling and taking advantage of what Mother Nature really has provided for us. So, Av, I want to thank you today for getting on, Dr. Av Singh. This has been a great topic today, Geoponics, Why Mother Nature Knows Best. This is one of my most passionate topics I love to talk about, so just appreciate you enlightening us today on, once again, you schooled me on many topics, and I'm walking away with a wealth of knowledge again, and I'm sure our audience did as well, so thank you very much. I want to thank our sponsor, Cannabis Tech Media. I'm Ellis Smith with American Cannabis Company. Thanks for tuning in today, and we will see you next month. Av, thank you so much for hopping on today. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Ellis.
Have a great day.
Take care.